An exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum, Exiled to Motown, presented by the Japanese American Citizens League.
I wanted to get involved and support in whatever way I could because I knew that it meant a lot to my family, but also to the broader community, and I felt like it was a really important opportunity to delve into these histories in a way that felt accessible to us.
Celeste Geddert's great-grandfather, Tadai Shimura, one of the first Japanese here in 1919, he knocked on Henry Ford's door, got hired as a company chemist. Shimura's friend James Harada worked for Ford too. When Diego Rivera painted the Detroit Institute of Art's mural in the early 30s, Harada was part of it. But it would be the 1940s, the mass relocation, that brought a lot more Japanese Americans to Detroit.
The incarceration in Japanese American history writ large often feels not only like a coastal story, but like a Pacific Coast story. And what I learned in coming here is that there is a very kind of vitally important part of that history that is kind of embedded and integral to the Midwest.
Most came during and after the war. John Okada wrote No-No Boy here, considered the first great Asian American novel. Larry Shinoda helped create the Corvette Stingray in Boss 302 Mustang.
With 4-barrel V8 and your choice of rear spoiler and backlight louvers.
Minoru Yamasaki designed the One Woodward building downtown, and later the Twin Towers in New York. They were Nisei, U.S.-born Americans. Ni as in two, second generation.
And the way that Japanese Americans count generations. We start the first generation as the first generation in the United States, not necessarily born in the United States. So my great-grandparents came to this country as Issei.
Issei, I as in Ichi, 1. San, 3. Sansei, third generation. That's me.
Usually I say I'm Yonsei or fourth generation Japanese American.
A wave of Japanese immigrants came at the turn of the last century, mostly to the West Coast.
Consider the record of the Japanese people in America. It's something to be proud of, making the western deserts into some of the most productive land in the world.
Then the incarceration and resettlement that's defined Japanese Americans to this day.
The way ahead. Where does it lead? That's what this young couple is wondering. Their life together lies in front of them.
And resettlement is something that actually began as early as 1943, where the US government was looking for places that they could relocate Japanese Americans to out of these incarceration camps without returning to what was then termed the Western Exclusion Zone.
Your friends, as they board the bus to leave the center, are going to new experiences and to a better way of living.
Many hundreds came here, you could say, exiled to Motown. On display, artifacts of displacement, heirlooms from the old country, the new country, things crafted in the camps, items saved by Geddert's great-aunt Toshi Shimura.
It is believed by some of my family members that this is the very suitcase, and actually the only piece of luggage at all, that Toshi was able to carry out of Topaz incarceration camp in Utah.
I was born in Stockton, California, and I was 11 when we got put into camp.
Mary Kamidoi told One Detroit her story at a gathering before the pandemic. Her family sent to a camp in Arkansas.
Our family and 12 others were the last people to leave the camp. These people didn't have a place to go either, so we ended out in Missouri and talk about discrimination.
Kamidoi and her sister came to Detroit, both working in an office at Ford Motor Company.
When I went to Ford's, I had to go to the general manager because everybody was so discriminating against me and my sister, and they didn't trust us. Every time we got up from our desk, somebody followed us. So one day, this stupid jerk that did it all the time to me, I went to the ladies' room and he had to go around the corner to go to the men's room. I said, here, this is where I'm going into. You want to come in here? No. And I thought, well, then stop following me.
The headline, Transplanted Nisei finds city kind and considerate. But Mary Kamidoi was deterred from buying a house in Dearborn, so she rented one on Grand Boulevard next to Hitsville, USA.
So on one hand, we had Japanese Americans who were being touted as these model newcomers to the city who were going to contribute to kind of the society of Detroit, but also had these instances where they were prohibited from buying property or from living in certain neighborhoods.
The curators see the resettlement curiously deliberate. Many came from tight-knit communities, places like Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. Here they'd spread out across Metro Detroit.
If they intermingled with the Midwest, which here is coded as being kind of the white Midwest, then there would be no Japanese American community to kind of feel threatened by.
They were really trying to strategize and craft a way that Japanese Americans would assimilate and not talk to each other.
An article tells how they've found success here. To the curators, it seems to imply it's because of their inherent racial qualities that others who've come to Detroit might not have.
It's like watching the model minority myth being crafted before your eyes.
Another headline set to stay, but many would return to the West Coast in the decades since. The 1980s, more history, with Japan blamed for the demise of the U.S. auto industry, a concern for all Asian Americans around here.
You know how they killed my son? One pushing the son hold him up. The father hit him in the head.
Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, was killed as Japan bashing became the rage.
And in that moment, I think it became clear for Asian Americans living in Metro Detroit that the distinctions between our communities under the heel of white supremacy ceased to matter.
This was when the Redress movement gained traction. Demands the government officially apologize for the mass incarceration.
The Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter president at the time wrote a letter to Ronald Reagan. He said that it may feel as though World War II is part of some distant past, but when we see what happens, for instance, to someone like Vincent Chin, that past is not distant and that these things are connected.
President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Japanese Americans who went to the camps received $20,000 each.
It's easy to look back and be like, oh, so redress happened, that was awesome. But that was years and years of organizing, very hard labor, of having to work with the US government, which I'm sure was very re-traumatizing for a lot of families.
Along with the history, the exhibit brings us back to today.
There are many more Asian Americans moving into the city.
Laura Misumi is a local activist.
There's kind of a wave of more kind of young professional millennial generation of Asian Americans that are moving into the city downtown area. But I wouldn't say like a whole community, just kind of individuals.
Now there's Tsuru for Solidarity. Fight against the mass incarceration of immigrants and refugees, symbolized by the folded cranes.
One of the larger points that we're trying to get at continually through this exhibit is, as a Japanese American person, you could look at your own family history, you could look at our broader history, and maybe decide to keep your head down. But I think our hope is that you let it politicize you and realize that you do have a responsibility to those other communities and that we are all connected in building this better future that we're all hoping for.